Hello, my name is Christina and I will be Christina Velasquez Fiddler, and I will be moderating the second half of today's program. Welcome back, everyone. If you joined us for the first half of our program, and if you're just joining us, welcome. I'm so glad you were able to join us today. Just some quick housekeeping. If you haven't reviewed our code of conduct, it's posted on our webpage. I encourage everyone who hasn't seen that to review it. Regarding our Q&A, please put any questions you have for our speakers in the chat. We will address them at the end of the presentation, and we'll be using progressive stacking to prioritize questions. If you could just identify as belonging to an underrepresented community by putting an asterisk in front of your question, that will help us prioritize your voice. We do have live captions. You'll want to click on more and then show subtitles. It might take a second for it to pop up, but please let us know if you have any issues. Someone from our conference committee will private chat you to help troubleshoot. So those are the quick little things to get us started. But now to the important bit. Our next speakers come to us from the University of Miami. Shatha Baydoun is the History, Modern Languages, and Literatures librarian at the University of Miami. And Ava Brillat is the librarian for English, English composition, classics, and theater arts. And the title of their talk is De-Colonizing One-Shot Instructions, Critical Pedagogical Approaches. And I'll pass it off to our speakers. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. Let me go ahead and share my screen and we'll get started. Okay. Thank you for joining us. Hello and welcome to our session. We will be talking about decolonizing the one-shot instruction, critical pedagogical approaches. My name is Ava Brillat. I am also the program lead for information literacy and instructional design at the University of Miami Richter Library. I would like to offer a short statement on my positionality for the purposes of reflexivity first. So I am engaging with this work from the stance of an able-bodied, cisgender, middle class person who identifies as white. While I was born and raised in Saudi Arabia, my visual identification as a white person affords me the many benefits of white supremacy. Many of my comments are directed towards other white people, particularly when it comes to my calls for action. My focus is on nonviolent communication. However, I do know I may unintentionally cause harm to non-white librarians, and I often speak from a heteronormative perspective. So apologies in advance for any harm I unintentionally cause you, especially if you identify as a member of a minoritized community. I'll let my colleague Shatha Baydoun also introduce herself.
Good afternoon. My name is Shatha Baydoun. I identify as cisgender, middle class, Middle Eastern, and Muslim. I grew up in Sierra Leone, West Africa. I immigrated to the US when I was 18. I work at the University of Miami as the liaison to departments of history and modern languages and literature. I state my positionality here, one, to acknowledge both the privileges and discriminations I experience, and two, as a starting point to our discussion of vocational awe and white supremacy.
Thank you, Shatha. I'm so happy to be here with you today. So thank you so much for joining us. We are going, forgive me. Okay. So to begin, allow me to offer some grounding ideas for setting intentions for a safe space. So change is difficult no matter what. Our hope is that for this session, you feel free to try on different perspectives. We also humbly ask that you pause and notice any emotional responses you may have during this session and offer yourself compassion. It can be difficult to hear perspectives that directly criticize our profession, especially if we hold our profession in high regard. So this leads me to perhaps the most important intention for this space, that of suspending the use of good and bad labels for actions in our work. In many discussions about anti-racist work, it is easy, especially if you are a member of the perceived majority, to disengage with these concepts because it feels as though we are bad people. We may feel a drive to find the right answer instead. This use of extreme categories of good and bad can shut down our efforts, especially if we have the luxury of disengaging with anti-racist work. So instead, I gently ask that we reframe this work in terms of a continuum. We're all in the process of becoming, and perhaps some of these concepts are still new and uncomfortable to contemplate, but that's all right. We're all on this journey and we're all in this state of becoming, not in a good state or a bad state. So to start our session, we will talk a little bit about vocational awe as a stumbling block to critical pedagogy. We'll segue into the one-shot and discuss some grounding anti-racist dispositions that will hopefully be helpful for realigning our instructional intentions with anti-racist work. Finally, we'll finish up with some examples of the application of anti-racist work in the one-shot session. So let's begin by unpacking vocational awe, specifically from the perspective of its use as a tool of white supremacy. So in 2018, for this section, I'll briefly discuss vocational awe, a definition to help us align our conversation. From there, I'll point out some historical information to support the practice of deconstructing vocational awe. And finally, I want to outline some thoughts for applying critical information literacy to librarianship as a profession. So let's begin by unpacking the term vocational awe. So in 2018, Fobazi Etar published an article on a well-known blog in the library with the lead pipe entitled Vocational Awe and Librarianship, the Lies We Tell Ourselves. So this is Etar's definition of vocational awe. And for our purposes today, let's highlight that we are talking about the assumptions that prevent us from critiquing libraries and librarianship. My next point in regards to vocational awe and librarianship resides on the historical development of our profession. So according to a University of Illinois occasional paper published in 1982 by Michael F. Winter, today's librarianship is a direct descendant of the widespread professionalization of careers that occurred in the late 19th century. This professionalization and codification of our profession was a result of industrialization. Older practices of librarianship were ill-equipped to meet the new demands of the industrial economic system, resulting in the establishment of schools and certifications focused on organizing, cataloging, and retrieving information. As a result, it is impossible to unlink our profession from the processes of capitalism. Given capitalism's colonialist bend towards exploitation in the name of profit, it becomes our duty, in fact, to be critical of our profession. The only way forward is through critical engagement, which leads to my next point that we as teachers of information literacy skills must use our own practices of our profession for our profession. So it's contingent upon us to use critical information literacy for critique. So using the ACRL framework for information literacy in higher education as a foundation, there are a number of frames that can guide us in critiquing librarianship. Starting with the research as inquiry frame, it becomes our responsibility to question the assumptions of our profession. In particular, the systems that we have used to collect and categorize information, supposedly from a presumed neutrality. The drive to systematize and collect information is colonialist, especially if this practice is not inherent to the colonized culture. If we are resistant to pursuing inquiry into the assumptions that we are making, then I would say we find ourselves in the grips of vocational awe, and that we aren't fully engaged in the practices of information literacy. So as we start this journey of inquiry, it can be frustrating and demoralizing. Perhaps we find ourselves feeling guilt or discomfort over our devotion to a white supremacist system. And this can spur us to look frantically for the right solution. What is the right answer to correct our mistakes? This line of thinking, however, is antithetical to anti-racist work and information literacy in general. Just as scholarship just as the scholarship as conversation frame outlines the iterative and ever-evolving nature of scholarship, so too must be our engagement with anti-racist work. It is my belief that we cannot achieve a decolonized library. We can only continue to inquire and iteratively evolve. So in the same way that we cannot wipe out the history of slavery, I would argue that we can never truly attain an anti-racist society, which I think should inspire us to continue to engage in conversation, not shut down our engagement because we will never have the right answer. One last brief example, the authority as constructed in contextual frame is ripe for decolonist inquiry, forgive me. Once we are inspired to question the structures that have been codified in librarianship, we then make room for other sources of authority, including indigenous knowledge systems and other non-capitalist focused systems of information gathering. So let's move from vocational awe to anti-racist pedagogy for this next session. So as you can see from this word cloud, when we talk about anti-racist pedagogy, there are many concepts that come up, such as intersectionality, anti-imperialism, anti-ableism, and many other practices. Anti-racism is complementary to many concepts, and as a result, it can be a little overwhelming to get started with intentionally engaging with anti-racist pedagogy, particularly in the library classroom. The OneShot is the stable of library instruction. In most libraries, the OneShot is one of the forms and often the main form for instruction. We can all relate to the challenges of the OneShot as an instructional method. When we add anti-racist pedagogy to the mix, it makes an already impossible situation seem even more so. There are many reasons not to do anti-racist work in the confines of the OneShot, including time, institutional culture, and many other reasons. However, many of these same characteristics are what make the OneShot an ideal place to use anti-racist intentional practices. The OneShot is a curriculum agnostic classroom experience. Because the OneShot is often where content delivery is secondary to skills development, it is a safe place to practice critical skills without jeopardizing the disciplinary socialization that often happens in the educational process. Additionally, the OneShot is a low stakes environment where critical inquiry can be practiced without any real negative repercussions. Finally, we can describe different perspectives without validating disinformation or conspiracy theory thought by teaching the information cycle and how to analyze sources for relevancy. While the work of anti-racism in the OneShot classroom may seem high stakes, we face even higher stakes if we choose to eschew anti-racist work. In the library classroom, it can be easy to look at a lesson plan and declare it as not supporting white supremacy while it remains riddled with colonialism. It is my belief that when we do not critique our knowledge systems that are founded in colonialist thought, we instead reinforce the system. If we do not engage from a critical perspective, we run the risk of tokenism in our resources or ending our anti-racist work when we have added the sufficient number of diversity resources. Finally, we continue to hold the OneShot as beyond, if we continue to hold the OneShot as beyond any change, as the only vehicle we have for supporting the development of information literacy skills, and therefore that it must be beyond critique, we run the risk of upholding that vocational awe in our own lives. This vocational awe not only stops anti-racist work, it also enables the same exploitative capitalist structures that cause widespread burnout in our profession. It is for all these reasons that we must move forward towards a critical stance in our work. Okay, so I will now turn this presentation over to my wonderful colleague Shatha, who will share some examples of anti-racist applications in the OneShot instructional session. And Shatha, just let me know when you need me to advance the slide and I will do so.
Thank you. So as Ava has explained, OneShots are embedded within structures of white supremacy. So in this section, I'm going to be sharing with you just some tips and techniques that you can use to integrate critical information literacy within your OneShots. one thing I really want to emphasize that this is not a not all or nothing kind of venture. Depending on the class of the subject area, some of these tips might be more applicable than others. What you really want to try to do here, and this is what I do, is think small. This way, you don't need to revamp all of your teaching materials, and the small changes allow you to form trust with your regular faculty who might be hesitant to embrace new ways of instruction. So for simplicity, I've just categorized these into my examples into two sections. Although as I go through them, you will notice that they are in fact fluid. Eva, next slide, please. So a hallmark of many one-shots is that database demo that we all do. And depending on the discipline, we each have a favorite go-to database that we use in our classes. For me, it is JSTOR. For others, it might be Web of Science. As part of this anti-racist pedagogy, you may choose to skip the database demo in favor of a more interactive or scaffolded instruction session. However, if you choose not to skip the database demo, there are some things that you can do to integrate anti-racist discourses within it. When we do a database demo, most of us tell our students about academic journals, and we talk about how the peer review process works. And as I often have a lot of undergraduates in my one-shot, I do explain what the peer review process is. But I follow this by telling my students that the system is not foolproof, that in fact, there have been many instances of research fraud in academia. I then use this to segue into the notion that the written word is not always the best and only source for research material. Depending on the class and the era I'm teaching, I point out the importance of oral histories, I point out the importance of poems and stories, and I often very much use the example of the griots and their importance as historians and storytellers in many parts of West Africa. What I'm also being mindful of here is relaying to students that there is a canon, but it is possible to work both within and outside the parameters of this canon. I'm also trying to impart the notion that in research, there are various knowledge systems that students can tap into. Just as I mentioned, my positionality in the intro as a way of declaring my privileges and discriminations, students can tap into their own funds of knowledge to defy this idea that the written word, especially one from an article or database, is the only and best system of knowledge one can use. If I'm teaching something more, quote unquote, modern, I also mention how ephemeral materials like zine reveal so much about counterculture and how they provide spaces for queerness to flourish. I love including comics and graphic novels because they provide spaces to discuss heavy topics in a much more lighter medium. For example, I could use the classic graphic novel Mouse, which talks about surviving the Holocaust, and juxtapose that with another graphic novel on Palestine, titled Palestine, that details the life of Palestinians in the Gaza Strip. So as you can see, there's nothing truly revolutionary in any of these examples that I'm talking about, but they do get students, hopefully, thinking about how academia and higher ed embody, as Ava explained, and what April Hathcock describes as the invisible normativity of whiteness. I do mention, especially when I'm doing a database demo, how information privilege works. I explain to students why we have password protections and paywalls, but this ultimately limits who, one, gets to be a scholar, and two, whose voice is being marginalized in this process. Personally, I started thinking about information privilege when I was working with a history faculty last year who assigns Wikipedia articles as an assignment in the class. While student had a choice based on the subject area on their entry, the faculty really wanted students to work on entries that were not so mainstream and popular. Sometimes students reached out and complained about the lack of resources. And to counter that, I will explain how publishing companies can create knowledge systems that legitimize certain disciplines over others. I also mentioned when I'm giving my database demo that there is bias in search engine algorithms. And while I may not go fully into this, I mentioned that I can recommend some readings to them. I also explained that there are biases in how data is depicted and presented. Here, I will tell students about the work of Muna Shalaby, who is a data journalist and an editor at The Guardian, who talks about taking the numb out of numbness and talks about biases in data representation. Next slide, please, Ava. So Ava has explained how white supremacy notions are embedded into library classification systems and how problematic these systems are. This is certainly not an issue in academic libraries. Witness, for example, in the classic Sanford Berman's classic book, Prejudices and Antipathies. In applying the ACL framework, information is power, it is possible to interrogate the LC classification while giving the one shot. This can be done in several ways. So for example, when I'm teaching my class on Native American and Global Indigenous Study, I mentioned that the Library of Congress classification is not designed with Indigenous people in mind. I also mentioned alternatives like the Maori subject headings, which cover subjects relating to the Australian Aborigine people. I follow this by mentioning that most universities in the US do not use this system in their library catalogs. Instead, the LC classification relegates Native Americans as Indians under the history classification E and F. This essentially imprisoned First People nations in the past and renders them ahistorical. Search terms are another way this interrogation can take place. I confess, I personally spend a lot of time thinking about my search term when I'm preparing for my one-shots. I'm conscious to choose terms that are not perpetuating heteronormative and cisgender structures. So for example, I'll talk about Black Lives Matter, the Tulsa Race Massacre, gender gap, or I'll even use Palestine or occupied territories rather than Israel to interrogate hegemonic systems. This also introduces students to different pedagogies such as post-colonial, queer, and or feminist theory that critically addresses white normative systems. Again, I came to think about this by looking at the work of Emily Derbinsky. To paraphrase, she says, when we do history on white people, we do not say, I'm looking for history on white females, but when you do others, you have to say, for example, things like Native American women or African American women. Lastly, in being cognizant of words and their meanings and the impact they have, I often add a harmful statement to my research guides. Our metadata remediation team constructed this statement, and I do it especially with guides that have the potential to perpetuate settler colonialism and hegemonic structures. For example, in teaching a session on Native American storytelling and resilience, I often take some time to read the statement. I am consciously aware of how tokenism works personally, but I'm also presenting students with the opportunity once again to engage with the ACL framework. Authority is constructed and contextual. It also gets students thinking about how library, museums, and archives and their connections with colonialism. So these are just some of the techniques that we have used as part of our attempt to decolonize one-shot instruction sessions. Back to you, Ava.
Thank you, Shatha. You always inspire me as well. So we don't have a lot of time together, unfortunately, but we do hope that our presentation has inspired you to actively align yourself with decolonialist and anti-racist pedagogies. As you have seen from our examples, one way to begin is by framing your work from the disposition of anti-racism. Perhaps the activities themselves seem to change slightly, but framing and context around these activities embrace anti-racism and decolonialism. Chances are you're already doing work in your classrooms that can easily be aligned with critical information literacy and anti-racism. We would encourage you to think about the work you are already doing in the classroom that needs just a slight nudge in order for it to fit the work of anti-racism. So in closing, we hope that you feel empowered to continue this work and to interrogate the vocational awe in librarianship. So I believe we have some time. We'll be happy to leave space for questions and answers. And then in our slides, we also have a list of our references. So we will go ahead and entertain any questions.
Shatha, Ava, thank you so much. A lot of great resource sharing from you and in our chat. I love all of the conversation going on in there. I do have a couple of questions that have come in. We only have a few minutes, but the first one is, I love zines. Could Shatha talk more about using zines in information literacy classes and how students and instructors have received zines-based instructions? That's a great question.
Okay, so Ava and I are both laughing because our colleague Jay Sylvester from Special Collection, who was supposed to join us on this call and in this presentation, he's the one who actually got me into zines, and the head of our Special Collections really uses that, is into that and cookbooks. So he's the person that has inspired me. He always talks about zines, and I use that just because, like I mentioned, in terms of queerness, in terms of counterculture, and the head of our Special Collections has told me this interesting story. She used to be into punk rock and she created her own zines, but we'll talk more about that some other time. Ava, do you have anything you want to add to this?
I do not. I think you are more advanced at using zines, so I'm so glad that you can share your experience with that. And then in response to some of the requests, I'm going to go ahead and throw up the references again. Oops, there we are.
That's great, thank you. And just as a reminder, this session is recorded, so our attendees will have access to it as well. Another question that's come in, how do you negotiate with faculty who sometimes want to teach to the database? Likely what they experienced as students. Sometimes, so this person says that they sneak content framing in, and it helps to see, for faculty to see how engaged students are, and that gives them more freedom next time to maybe do similar things. Are there other strategies to maybe the smaller steps that you talked about?
Shatha, let me give you some space to share your thoughts, and then I can jump in after.
So I have when I first joined in the University of Miami, I had a regular faculty who would every semester call me to give a one-shot, and he was used to the old ways of doing things. And so when I tried to sneak these things in there was a lot of resistance, right? There was like, oh yes, we should never use Wikipedia. And so this kind of resistance happened. So what I did decide to do is I actually took the faculty, and this is me bribing my faculty. No, I took the faculty and then I explained some of these things we were having. So it does help because we both grew up in West Africa. So I sort of snuck these things. And I think at the moment when I was telling him about how I'm trying to revamp my lesson plans and add sort of anti-racist pedagogy in them, there was a little bit of resistance, but I noticed actually that this semester doing that, it hasn't been as confrontational. So I guess for me, whenever there's resistance, I think a cup of coffee, a cup of tea can solve all the world's problem. That's just, you know, a personal opinion.
I think that's a great answer. I think we can fit one more question in. I don't have anything to add on top of that.
I have a question. For folks who, like myself, didn't grow up with access to, like, quote, the canon. When you said the canon, it really, like, it brought a lot of feelings, because when you don't have access to it, and then you're suddenly in a space where you recognize the complexities of it, but you have students who want to know it because they were never exposed to it. It kind of creates this tension with you who's helping provide information to individuals who wanted or were never given the opportunities to get, who feel like they need that information. How do you kind of balance or approach that tension? Or what are your thoughts around that?
If you'll allow me, let me stop sharing so I can take a look. You know, that's a really great point. So you're touching upon the idea that our students are not a monolith, right? And we have many different types of student experiences. I think it's important to, and I think this is the process of being critical is to recognize the myth of that monolith, that there is a variety of different perspectives and then being accessible to those different types of perspectives, those different types of experiences as well. I think the process of critiquing within the OneShot hopefully can help with lessening the pain of seeming as if you are an information have-not because of these larger systems that are put into place that have created those information have-nots. So I will stop commenting on that and give some space to my colleague Shatha to also share.
You said it, Eva. I have nothing to add. Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you so much. I wish somebody had told me that when I was a college student. That's so
Yes.
powerful. Thank you. So we're at 1:45. We're going to take a short 10-minute break. A big shout out and thank you to Eva and Shatha for that. That was wonderful.